100 years had passed since humanity vanished from Council space, and the galaxy that had once hummed with the activity of 1,000 worlds had grown quiet and cold. The great empires had fallen, one by one, consumed by wars they could not end, and plagues they could not cure, and famines they could not prevent. Unity Station drifted empty through the void, a monument to arrogance that no one visited anymore. The species that had once ruled the stars now huddled on their homeworlds, too broken and too few to dream of anything beyond survival. Lyra Vistani was young for a Rithani, barely 200 years old, and she had grown up on stories of the golden age before the collapse. Her grandmother had been alive when the humans left, and she had told Lyra about the strange soft-bodied creatures who had worked tirelessly for species that never thanked them. They were the best of us, her grandmother had said, not the strongest or the smartest, but the kindest, and we threw them away like they meant nothing. Lyra had become an explorer because she wanted to find out what had happened to the humans, wanted to know if they had survived the journey to wherever they had gone. Most Rithani thought she was foolish for wasting her time on a species that had probably died out long ago. But Lyra could not shake the feeling that there was more to the story she had spent decades searching, following rumors and ancient records and fragmentary data that led her deeper and deeper into unexplored space. And finally, on a day that seemed like any other day, she found what she was looking for. Human colony hung in the darkness like a jewel suspended in black velvet, and Lyra had to stop her ship and simply stare at it for a long time because she had never seen anything so beautiful. It was not a single world, but a constellation of habitats, stations, and terraformed moons, all linked together by threads of light that pulsed with energy. Ships moved between the structures in elegant patterns, and even from this distance, Lyra could see that the technology was far beyond anything the old council had ever possessed. She activated her communication system and sent a greeting in the old council standard language. Not really expecting anyone to respond, the response came within seconds. "Welcome, traveler," a warm voice said in perfect Rithani. "We have been expecting visitors from your region for some time now. Please proceed to Docking Bay 7, and someone will be there to meet you." Lyra guided her ship toward the indicated bay, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She did not know what to expect from a species that had every reason to hate her kind, and she would not have blamed them if they turned her away. But when the docking bay doors opened and she stepped out of her ship, she found a small group of humans waiting for her with smiles on their faces. "Welcome to New Terra," said an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "My name is Elena Vance, and I am the granddaughter of the last human ambassador to the Galactic Council." Lyra felt her legs grow weak at the name. "Vance," she whispered. "Ambassador Alara Vance?" Elena nodded, and there was no anger in her expression, only a gentle understanding. "My grandmother lived to be 112, she said. She spent her final years helping to build this place, and she never stopped hoping that someday someone from the old council would find us." Elena led Lyra through the colony, and what Lyra saw made her want to weep with wonder. The humans had not merely survived their exile. They had flourished beyond anything Lyra could have imagined. The streets were filled with laughter and music, and everywhere she looked she saw people working together, creating together, living together in harmony. And it was not just humans. Lyra saw species she had never encountered before, beings from worlds far beyond council space, all living alongside the humans as equals and friends. "After we left, we kept exploring," Elena explained. "We found other species out here, species the council had never contacted, and we invited them to join us. We told them about our history, about how we had been treated, and we promised them that we would never treat them the same way. This is what we built together." They walked through gardens filled with plants from 100 different worlds, Past schools, where children of different species learned side by side. Past hospitals, where doctors treated patients of every biology with equal care, was everything the council had claimed to be and had never actually become. Lyra stopped in the middle of a plaza where a fountain sang with crystal water, and she felt the weight of 100 years of guilt pressed down on her shoulders. "Why did you welcome me?" she asked, and her voice broke on the words. "After everything my people did to yours, after the way we laughed at your ambassador and celebrated when you left, why would you show me any kindness at all?" Elena was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "My grandmother asked herself the same question many times," she said. "She wondered whether humanity should carry its anger forever, whether we should nurture our resentment till it grew into something dark and bitter. But she decided that anger was a poison that hurt the one who carried it more than anyone else. She decided that the best revenge against those who had dismissed us was to become everything. They said we could never be, not conquerors, not avengers, just a species that learned from its pain and chose to build something beautiful instead of something terrible." Elena took Lyra's hands in her own, and her grip was warm and strong. "We do not hate you," she said. "We never did. We simply realized that we deserved better than a seat at a table that never wanted us. So we built our own table, and we made sure there was room for everyone who wanted to sit down." Lyra stayed with the humans for 3 months, learning about their history and their culture and the incredible things they had accomplished since leaving council space. She learned that they had developed faster than light travel that made the old council ships look like primitive rafts. She learned that they had cured diseases that had killed billions, had unlocked the secrets of longevity that allowed humans to live for centuries, had created art and music and literature that made her weep with joy. She learned that they had faced challenges and setbacks and moments of despair, but they had always found a way to move forward together. When it was time for her to leave, Elena gave her a small data crystal containing a message. "We knew this day would come eventually," Elena said. "We knew that someday someone from the old council would find us and want to know what we were thinking. This message is for whoever still remains back home. We hope it helps." Lyra made the long journey back to what remained of council space, and when she arrived, she gathered the scattered survivors and played the message for them. The face of an old human woman appeared on the screen, and Lyra recognized her from the historical archives as Ambassador Alara Vance, recorded some time before her death. "To the species of the Galactic Council," Ambassador Vance said, and her voice was tired but not unkind. "If you are watching this, then you have found what remains of humanity, and you have seen what we have built. I want you to know that we did not leave in anger. We left in sorrow. We left because we had spent 300 years hoping that you would see us as equals. And we finally understood that hoping for something does not make it happen. We do not blame you for what you did. We simply chose to stop waiting for you to change." She paused, and her expression softened. "We hope you find your way," she said. "We hope you learn from what happened and build something better than what came before. We will not be returning, because we have built a home that we love and we see no reason to leave it. But we wish you well. We truly do. May you find the kindness that you never showed us. May you learn to see each other the way we always wanted you to see us. And may you remember, in the years to come, that the smallest and weakest among you might be the ones holding everything together." The message ended, and silence fell over the survivors. The Rathani and the Velthari and the few remaining members of other species looked at each other with new eyes. And for the first time in a century, no one spoke words of blame or accusation. They moved on. Someone finally said, "They actually moved on." Lyra thought about what she had seen in the human colony. The laughter and the music and the joy of a species that had chosen Hope over hatred, she thought about her grandmother's words. About the best of us who had been thrown away, and she thought about the future. About what the survivors might build if they could learn from the mistakes of the past. The galaxy had never felt so empty. And yet somehow, for the first time in 100 years, it also felt like there might be room for something new to grow somewhere out there. Beyond the darkness of space, humanity was thriving, and perhaps, if the survivors worked very hard, and tried very hard and learned to be kind to each other, they might someday deserve to know them again. 20 years had passed since the humans vanished into the darkness between stars, and the Galactic Council that had once ruled 1,000 worlds was dying high arbiter. Thiessen stood at the window of his private chamber and watched Unity Station crumble around him. Entire sections had gone dark because no one knew how to repair the power systems that humans had designed and maintained. The gardens that had once filled the station with life and color had withered because the irrigation systems had failed, and no one could figure out how to fix them. The great hall where the council had once gathered now sat empty most days because there was no point in holding sessions when half the delegates could not understand each other and the other half refused to attend. The war between the Velthari and the Kreth had started over something so small that Thiessen could not even remember when it had been a trade insult, perhaps, or a diplomatic slight, or maybe just the accumulated frustration of two species who had never actually liked each other and had only maintained peace, because human mediators had constantly smoothed over their conflicts, whatever the cause. The result had been catastrophic. 17 billion beings had died in the first 3 years of fighting alone, and the death toll continued to rise as both sides committed atrocities that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. The Kreth had deployed biological weapons on Velthari colony worlds, and the Velthari had responded by shattering the moons of the Kreth homeworld and sending the fragments crashing into the planet below. Human diplomats would have found a way to stop this madness before it started. Thiessen thought, and the thought brought a bitter taste to his mouth because he had been one of those who had laughed loudest when Ambassador Vance had begged the council to recognize humanity's service. He remembered her face, tired and hopeful and so desperately wanting to believe that the galaxy might finally accept her people. He remembered how he had dismissed her words as the emotional ramblings of a lesser species. He remembered how he had celebrated when the humans left. The Orion Plague had been the next disaster, a viral mutation that spread through 3 systems before anyone even realized it was happening. In the old days, human epidemiologists would have identified the threat within hours and developed a treatment within weeks. Instead, the plague burned through populations unchecked for 6 months, while council scientists argued about whose fault it was and whose responsibility it was to find a cure. 200 million beings died before the plague finally burned itself out, and the survivors were left with permanent neurological damage that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The communion of YTH, the eldest and most respected of all the council races, had collapsed into civil war when their supply lines failed. The YTH had always been dependent on resources from other systems, their own home world having been depleted millennia ago, and human logistics experts had managed the complex web of trade routes that kept their civilization alive. Without those experts, shipments began arriving late or not at all, and the YTA turned on each other in a desperate scramble for resources. The Civil War had lasted 8 years and had ended only when there were not enough. If left alive to continue fighting, Thiessen had watched all of this happen, had watched the galaxy tear itself apart, and he had done nothing because there was nothing he could do. The council was broken, its authority shattered by decades of failures and catastrophes, and no one listened to the High Arbiter anymore. He was an old Velthari now, his crystalline body clouded with age, and he knew he did not have much time left. Perhaps that was why he finally decided to open the classified archives. The archives had been sealed for centuries, containing records that the Council's leaders had deemed too dangerous or embarrassing to be made public. Thyssen had the authority to access them. Had always had the authority, but he had never been curious enough to look now. With nothing left to lose, he entered the archive chamber and began to read. The first files he found were Ambassador Vance's reports, thousands of them stretching back decades. Each one meticulously detailed and thoughtfully analyzed. He had never read any of them while she was alive because he had assumed they contained nothing of value now. As he scrolled through page after page, he realized how wrong he had been. She had seen everything, every weakness in the Council's infrastructure, every impending crisis, every disaster that was waiting to happen. She had documented it all with careful precision and had proposed solutions for every single problem. The translation matrix degradation had been predicted in a report, filed 60 years before the humans left, along with a detailed plan for how to prevent it. The emergency response shortage had been flagged as a critical vulnerability in at least a dozen separate analyses, each one ignored by the Council leadership. The trade route instabilities, the medical system dependencies, the supply chain vulnerabilities, every single failure that it brought the galaxy to its knees had been anticipated and could have been prevented if only someone had listened, if only someone had read. Thyssen found himself weeping, something his species had not done in 10,000 years. And he did not try to stop the tears that ran down his crystalline face. He read a report from Ambassador Vance dated just 1 month before the departure, and her words burned themselves into his memory. "We have served the Council faithfully for 3 centuries." She had written, "We have given everything we have and asked for nothing in return except recognition of our worth. That recognition has been denied. I do not write this report with anger, but with sadness, because I truly believe that the galaxy could have been something better than what it has become. I hope that someday the species who have dismissed us will understand what they have lost. I hope that someday they will find their way to something better. But we cannot wait any longer for that day to come. We must build our own future now, while we still have the strength to do so." Thyssen closed the file and sat in the darkness for a long time. Thought about all the times he had looked down at the human delegation from his high platform. All the times he had made jokes about their short lifespans and their emotional nature. All the times he had treated them as less than nothing. He thought about Ambassador Vance standing in the speaking sphere, begging the Council to see her people as equals. And he thought about how he had laughed. The galaxy was burning because of that laughter, because of the arrogance of species who had convinced themselves that they did not need anyone else. The Thyssen activated the station's communication system and recorded a message. "To whoever finds this archive," he said, his voice trembling with age and grief, "I am High Arbiter Thyssen of the Volturi, and I am recording this as my final act before my death. I want future generations to know what happened here, and I want them to understand why. We had helpers," he said. "We had friends, though we never called them that. We had a species that gave us everything and asked only to be seen as equals in return. We laughed at them. We dismissed them. We drove them away. And now we are dying because we never learned how to survive without them." He paused and gathered himself. "If the humans ever hear this message, I want them to know that I am sorry. I am sorry for the laughter and the dismissal and the 3 centuries of cruelty. I am sorry that it took the death of everything I knew for me to finally understand what we had lost. I hope they have found happiness wherever they are. I hope they have built something better than what we destroyed. They deserve so much more than we ever gave them." He ended the recording and let the silence wash over him outside his window. The stars continued to shine, indifferent to the suffering of species who had never learned to value each other. Thyssen closed his eyes and waited for the end. The Valkyrie threw a celebration on the day they realized the humans were truly gone. A grand feast with music and dancing and speeches about the purity of the council finally being restored, High Arbiter. Thesan himself raised a crystal goblet, filled with starlight wine, and proclaimed that the galaxy had entered a new golden age. No longer will we be burdened by the emotional neediness of lesser species, he declared to thunderous applause. No longer will we have to pretend that servants deserve a seat at our table. The Rithani delegation nodded along because they had always found humans rather exhausting with their constant questions and their strange habit of forming attachments to everyone they worked with. The Kreth celebrated in their own way, which involved ritual combat and the consumption of raw meat. And they too expressed relief that the soft-bodied humans would no longer be around to make them feel guilty about their violent tendencies. For one glorious month, the Galactic Council reveled in their newfound freedom, and then the problems began. The first sign came when the translation matrices started producing errors. During a routine session, the Velthari delegate said something about trade quotas, and the Morduk representative heard something about personal insults. And within minutes, the two species were screaming at each other across the chamber. It took 4 hours to sort out the misunderstanding, and by the end of it, several minor trade agreements had collapsed, a temporary malfunction. The Council's technical staff assured everyone the systems simply need recalibration, but the technical staff had no idea how to recalibrate systems that had been designed and maintained exclusively by humans for the past 3 centuries. They poked at control panels they did not understand and ran diagnostic programs that returned results in languages they could not read. And the errors continued to multiply within 3 months. The translation matrices had degraded to the point where basic communication between species had become nearly impossible. Council sessions turned into chaotic shouting matches as delegates misinterpreted each other's words and took offense at phrases that had been perfectly innocent. The Rithani ambassador demanded to know why no one had thought to document how the translation systems worked. The answer, which no one wanted to admit, was that everyone had assumed the humans would always be there to fix things. The emergency response fleet was the next casualty when a mining station in the outer reaches suffered a catastrophic reactor failure. The Council dispatched a rescue team composed entirely of Velthari volunteers. The Velthari had never actually done rescue work before, but they assumed their superior intellect would make up for their lack of experience. They arrived at the mining station 12 hours after the distress call because no one had bothered to learn the fastest routes through the asteroid field by then. Half the miners had already died from oxygen deprivation. The Velthari rescue team spent another 6 hours trying to figure out how to dock with the damaged station. And when they finally made it inside, they discovered that their crystalline bodies were too fragile to navigate the twisted wreckage. They pulled out 17 survivors and left 43 bodies behind. In the old days, under human leadership, the rescue would have been completed in 4 hours with 0 additional casualties. When news of the disaster spread, the Council held an emergency session to discuss what had gone wrong. The Rithani delegates suggested hiring mercenaries to replace the human emergency teams, but no mercenary company wanted the job because the pay was terrible and the work was dangerous, and the Council had a reputation for treating its workers poorly. The Kreth representative proposed training their own warriors for rescue missions, but the Kreth training methods were so brutal that the first class of volunteers all quit within a week. Perhaps we should contact the humans and ask them to return, the Morduk delegate suggested quietly. The chamber fell silent. High Arbiter Thesan's crystalline face turned a shade of purple that indicated extreme displeasure. We will not go crawling back to those who abandoned us, he declared, "The humans made their choice, and we will not give them the satisfaction of seeing us fail." So they did not contact the humans. And the failures continued to mount. The medical stations that had once served as beacons of healing across council space began to close one by one as the doctors who had staffed them, vanished human physicians, had somehow understood how to treat every species, had somehow known which medications would help and which would harm, had somehow developed cures for diseases that had plagued the galaxy for millennia without them. The Rithani discovered that the medicine they had been taking for joint pain was actually designed for Kreth biology and was slowly poisoning their nervous systems without them. The Velthari learned that the atmospheric controls on their homeworld had been secretly modified by human engineers to filter out a toxin that their own scientists had never even detected without them. A dozen minor plagues spread unchecked. Through systems that had once been protected by human medical protocols, the trade routes collapsed. Next, because human negotiators had been the only thing standing between rival species and open economic warfare, the Velthari had always assumed that trade flowed smoothly because of their own natural superiority. But they discovered that human diplomats had been working constantly behind the scenes to prevent disputes from escalating. A disagreement over shipping lanes that a human mediator would have resolved in an afternoon turned into a 6-month standoff that cost both sides billions of credits. A minor tariff dispute between the Kreth and the Mordek spiraled into a full trade embargo that left 3 colony worlds on the brink of starvation. And through it all, the Council refused to admit what was becoming increasingly obvious. They had taken humanity for granted, had assumed that the invisible labor holding their civilization together was simply the natural order of things, had never once stopped to consider what would happen if that labor suddenly stopped. The Rithani ambassador finally broke the silence one year after the departure. "We need to send a message to Earth," she said, during a particularly chaotic session where 3 separate trade wars were threatening to collapse into actual shooting wars. "We need to ask the humans to come back this time." No one argued. The message was composed with great care, full of diplomatic language and carefully worded phrases that managed to ask for help without quite admitting fault. It was transmitted to Earth on every frequency the Council could access. Repeated over and over for days, the response came 1 week later, and it was exactly 4 words long. HFY is nitrogen monoxide. Longer accepting communications from the Galactic Council. The message said, "TSI's decision is final." The Rithani ambassador stared at the screen for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was very small. "What do we do now?" she asked. No one had an answer. The day of the vote arrived with all the ceremony the Galactic Council could muster, which meant golden banners and singing crystals and speeches that went on for hours, while humanity waited in silence on the lowest platform. Ambassador Alara Vance had dressed in her finest uniform, the deep blue one with silver trim that she saved for occasions like this. Around her sat the entire human delegation, 50 men and women who had dedicated their lives to representing their species on this station. They held hands beneath the table where no one could see, a small gesture of solidarity in a room that had never offered them any. High Arbiter Thiessen of the Velthari rose from his crystal throne and raised all 4 of his arms to call for silence. "We gather today to vote on the petition submitted by the human species for full membership in the Galactic Council," he announced, his voice ringing through the chamber like a bell made of ice, as required by tradition. "The petitioning species will now present their case." Alara stood and took a deep breath because this was the moment she had been preparing for her entire career. She walked to the speaking sphere at the center of the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. distinguished representatives of the Galactic Council, she began, her voice steady despite the fear that twisted in her stomach. For 300 years, humanity has served this body with dedication and sacrifice that, I believe, speaks for itself. She activated the holographic display she had prepared, and images began to float around her like ghosts made of light. In the past century alone, human emergency response teams have saved the lives of over 6 billion citizens across Council space, she said. Our doctors have developed treatments for 17 diseases that were previously considered incurable. And our engineers have built a communication network that allows this chamber to function. The images showed humans running into burning buildings, humans working through the night in medical bays, humans floating in the void of space, repairing damaged stations while elder species watched. From the safety of observation decks, our diplomats have mediated 437 disputes that would have otherwise resulted in armed conflict. Elara continued, we have asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to one day be considered equals among the species we have served. She paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who had never once looked at her with anything resembling respect. We ask only that you recognize what we have given, she said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the final word. We ask only that you see us. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and Elara allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her words had reached someone. Then the Velthari representative laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. Not exactly, but it carried the dismissive amusement of someone who had just heard a child say something foolish. The human ambassador speaks of service as if it were something remarkable, the Velthari said. But service is simply what lesser species do while they wait to become worthy of recognition. Other representatives began to nod, and Elara felt her hope crumble like ash in her hands. The humans have indeed been useful, the Rithani delegate agreed, but useful is not the same as advanced. And we cannot grant full membership to a species that has contributed nothing to galactic advancement. Nothing? Elara heard herself say, her voice rising despite her training. We have given you everything. The Velthari waved one crystalline hand in dismissal. You have given us labor, he said. Any species can provide labor. And your short lifespans make you particularly efficient at tasks that would bore more sophisticated beings. The vote was conducted quickly, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone entered the chamber. One by one, the elder races cast their votes, and one by one, the holographic tally showed the same result. Opposed. Not a single species voted in favor of humanity's petition. Not even the smaller races who had benefited most directly from human aid. When the final vote was counted, High Arbiter Thizin turned to face the human delegation with something that might have been pity. The petition is denied, he said. The human species will retain its provisional membership status and may submit another petition in 100 years. 100 years, Elara thought. And she wanted to scream, because none of the humans in this room would live to see another petition. That was the cruelty of it. The way the Council used humanity's short lifespans against them, knowing that each new generation would have to start the process over from the beginning. She walked back to the lowest platform and sat down among her people. And she saw in their eyes the same devastation she felt in her heart. 300 years of service. And this was their reward that night. Elara sat alone in her quarters and stared at the communication terminal for a long time. Her hands were steady. When she finally reached for the controls, because she had always known this moment would come, even if she had hoped it would not, she typed a single phrase into the encrypted channel that only a handful of humans knew existed. Pyrometia Sionefi Remede response came within seconds, as if someone on the other end had been waiting. ACKO notably. The message said, B. Giant Departure Protocol Seller closed her eyes and let out a breath. she felt she had been holding for 40 years the next morning. She called a meeting of the entire human delegation and told them what was about to happen. Some of them cried, and others nodded as if they had been expecting this all along. Few asked if there was any other way, if there was anything they could do to change the council's mind. "We have been trying to change their minds for 300 years," Alara said gently. "Some minds do not want to be changed within hours." The departure had begun. Humans across Unity Station began packing their belongings quietly and efficiently. Without making any fuss, they left notes for the colleagues who might wonder where they had gone. Simple messages that said only that they were going home. The Rithani ambassador noticed the activity and stopped Alara in the corridor. "Where is everyone going?" she asked, and her silver face showed genuine confusion. "Home," Alara said. And she smiled because it felt strange to finally be telling the truth. "But you cannot leave," the Rithani protested. "Who will run the emergency response teams, and who will staff the medical stations, and who will handle the translation systems?" Alara looked at this being who had never once acknowledged her existence except to make demands, and she felt something shift inside her chest. It was not anger, not exactly, but something colder and more final. "I suppose you will have to find someone else," she said. Within 1 week, every human in council space was gone. They left behind spotless workstations and carefully organized files. Because even in leaving, they could not bring themselves to be careless. They left behind instructions for how to operate the systems they had built. Though they knew the instructions would probably go unread, they left behind 3 centuries of memories. 3 centuries of hope, 3 centuries of reaching out toward a galaxy that had never reached back. And then they were gone, slipping away into the darkness between stars, heading toward the colonies that no one else knew existed. The council did not realize what had happened until 3 days after the last human ship departed. By then, the translation systems had already begun to fail. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian, and at its center floated the speaking sphere, where representatives of 1,000 worlds gathered to decide the fate of the galaxy. Ambassador Alara Vance stood at the lowest platform, the one closest to the floor, the one reserved for humanity since the day they had first been granted provisional membership. 300 years ago, she had grown used to looking up at the other species, their platforms rising in tiers based on how important the council considered them to be. Velthari sat at the highest level, their crystalline bodies catching the light from a dozen artificial suns that hung from the ceiling like captured stars. Below them were the Rithani, tall and elegant with their silver skin and 6 arms that moved like dancers, even when they were simply reaching for a drink. Then came the Kreth, the Communion of Ith, the Mordek Collective, and dozens of other elder races who had traveled between stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. And at the bottom, always at the bottom, sat the humans. Alara listened as High Arbiter Thiessen of the Velthari droned on about trade regulations, his voice echoing through the chamber like wind through a crystal cave. She took notes because that was what humans did. Even though no one ever read her reports, even though no one ever asked for her opinion, even though she had been doing this job for 40 years and still received the same dismissive glances she had gotten on her first dia. Young Aide approached her platform and handed her a tablet containing the schedule for tomorrow. "Ambassador, you have been assigned to mediate the border dispute between the Kreth and the Mordek," he whispered. Alara nodded, because of course she had been assigned to that duty. It was dangerous work, the kind of work that had killed 3 human diplomats in the past decade alone. But someone had to do it, and someone was always human. The Kreth and Mordok had been fighting for 800 years, and their hatred for each other ran so deep that neither side could stand to be in the same room without violence erupting, but humans could calm them down somehow. Humans could read the tiny shifts in Kreth scales that indicated rising aggression, and they could sense the subtle changes in Mordak pheromones that signaled an impending attack. No other species in the galaxy had this ability. This strange gift for understanding emotions across the vast gulf between different forms of life. The Council called it useful but unremarkable. A minor talent that made humans good servants, but nothing more after the session ended. Ilara walked through the corridors of Unity Station, the massive space station that served as the Council's headquarters. She passed by emergency response teams preparing for a rescue mission in the outer reaches. And she smiled sadly when she saw that every single member of those teams was human. The Velthari had declared such work beneath them centuries ago. Ridhani found the danger unacceptable. The elder races had all found excuses, one by one, until only humans remained willing to fly into burning stations and collapsing mines and plague-ridden colonies. Captain Marcus Chen saw her passing and gave her a tired wave. "Another double shift," he said, and his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. "The ETH homeworld is having seismic problems again, and they need supply runs every 6 hours to keep the shelters stocked. Have they thanked you yet?" Alara asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The governor told me the humans should be grateful for the opportunity to prove our worth to the galaxy," he said. "I have lost 2 crew members this month to those supply runs. And she talks about gratitude like we should be kissing her feet." Alara put her hand on his shoulder because words felt inadequate in moments like this. She had attended too many funerals, had written too many letters to families back on Earth, had watched too many young humans sacrifice everything for a galaxy that would never love them back. Later that night, she sat alone in her quarters and opened the private log she had been keeping for 40 years. Entry number 14,216. She wrote about the day's events, about the way the Velthari representative had made a joke about human lifespans during the session, about how the entire chamber had laughed while the human delegation sat in silence. She wrote about how the Rithani had complained that their coffee was cold, not knowing or caring that the human who had prepared it had been awake for 30 hours straight, helping with disaster relief. She wrote about the small cruelties and the casual dismissals and the way the galaxy treated humanity like furniture, useful but invisible, necessary but never appreciated. And then she wrote about Project Prometheus. It had started 80 years ago, long before Alara had been born, when a group of human leaders had gathered in secret to discuss the future. They had looked at the pattern of the past 2 centuries and had seen what was coming. They had understood that no matter how hard humanity worked, no matter how many lives they gave, no matter how indispensable they made themselves, the Council would never accept them as equals. So they had begun to prepare quietly, carefully, without anyone noticing. Humanity had started building a future that did not depend on the approval of species who would never give it. They had mapped every system they maintained, recorded every piece of knowledge they acquired, developed technologies they kept hidden from Council inspectors who never bothered to look too closely anyway. They had established colonies beyond Council space, places where humans could live and grow and thrive without asking permission from anyone. And they had waited 300 years of waiting, 300 years of smiling and serving and pretending that everything was fine, 300 years of being the quiet helpers who never complained and never demanded and never stopped. Working. Zelara closed her log and looked out the window at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the borders of Council space, millions of humans were building something new, something that belonged to them alone. She thought about her grandchildren, born on a colony world that the Council did not even know existed, growing up free from the burden of proving their worth to species who had already decided they were worthless. Tomorrow, she would go back to the Council chamber and stand on the lowest platform and take notes. That no one would read tomorrow, she would smile and nod and pretend that humanity was content with its place in the galaxy, but she knew, as every human knew, that tomorrow would not last forever. The vote on full membership was coming in 3 months, and humanity had submitted their petition with all the proper forms and all the required documentation, and all the hope that 3 centuries of service might finally be recognized. Alara did not expect the council to say yes, but she hoped, as all humans hoped, that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time the galaxy would see what humanity had given and would give something back in return. She fell asleep with that hope still flickering in her heart, small and fragile, but not yet extinguished, not yet ready to die. Outside her window, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the dreams of a species that had spent 300 years waiting for a kindness that might never come.